I need to tell you what happened to me in the woods behind my house on a night when the stars burned brighter than I'd ever seen them. Because if I don't speak this truth, I'll carry it like a stone in my chest until my last breath. The blue light that woke me wasn't lightning, and it wasn't a dream, it was a tearing sound, like the sky itself was being ripped open by invisible hands, followed by an impact that shook my bedroom windows and sent our dog into a howling frenzy that wouldn't stop. My wife didn't wake, and looking back now, I understand that some moments are meant for only one witness, chosen not by merit, but by a grace I'll never fully comprehend. I pulled on my boots and jacket without thinking, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, something that felt like a summons written into my very bones. The forest was alive with an otherworldly glow, pulsing between silver and gold, casting shadows that moved against the natural laws of light and darkness. Every step I took felt both terrifying and sacred, as if I was walking toward an altar I didn't know existed. The air tasted metallic and sweet, like breathing in starlight itself, and I could hear a low humming that wasn't quite sound but vibration, resonating in my chest cavity where my heart was hammering. When I reached the clearing, I saw the craft embedded in the earth, its hull glowing with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to contain entire languages of meaning. Steam and something like liquid light poured from the ruptures in its side, and that's when I saw him, a figure trapped in the wreckage, his form both familiar and impossibly strange, reaching toward me with a hand that had too many joints yet moved with profound grace. His eyes found mine across that burning distance, and in them I saw something that made me forget every fear I'd ever known. I saw recognition, urgency, and an ancient sorrow that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The heat from the craft was intensifying, and I could see smaller explosions beginning to ripple through its structure, each one sending cascades of that strange luminous fluid across the forest floor. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to run, to get away, to preserve my own life and return to the safety of my home and the sleeping wife I'd promised to protect and cherish. But his eyes held me there, those impossibly large eyes that reflected not just the firelight, but something deeper, something that looked like the weight of watching humanity stumble through darkness for millennia. I heard myself shouting that I was coming, though I don't remember making the decision to move forward, only that my body was suddenly in motion, scrambling over the torn earth and twisted metal. The heat was unbearable, searing my exposed skin, singeing my hair. But I reached into that wreckage and grabbed his arm. His skin felt like warm silk over a frame that was lighter than it should have been, as if his bones were made of something between matter and energy. He cried out, not in words but in a frequency that I felt in my skull, a sound of both agony and desperate hope that I'll hear until the day I die. Together we pulled him free just as a surge of energy exploded from the craft's core, sending us both tumbling backward into the soft moss and fallen leaves. I dragged him, half carrying and half pulling his form that seemed to flicker between solid and translucent, away from the burning vessel and deeper into the darkness of the woods. My basement door had never seemed so far away, and I was weeping without knowing why, tears streaming down my face as I whispered prayers I hadn't spoken since childhood, begging God for strength and protection for reasons I couldn't yet name. When I finally got him down the stairs and onto the old couch, where I'd spent countless nights watching meaningless television, I collapsed beside him, both of us breathing hard, both of us alive against all logic and probability. His wounds were closing before my eyes, flesh knitting together with threads of light, and I realized with a certainty that shook my entire understanding of reality. I hadn't just saved a life tonight. I had been chosen to receive a message that would crack open everything I thought I knew about heaven, earth, and the thin veil between them. The silence in my basement was profound, broken only by our breathing, his shallow and rhythmic, mine ragged with adrenaline and creeping awe at what I'd just done. I should have been terrified, should have been calling someone, anyone, but instead I found myself kneeling beside him, studying his face in the dim light filtering through the window wells. His features were elongated, but beautiful, possessing a symmetry that seemed mathematically perfect, and his skin held an inner luminescence that pulsed faintly with each breath he took. The wounds that had been gaping and terrible were now thin silver lines, healing with a speed that made me question whether I was hallucinating, whether I'd hit my head in the rescue and was dreaming all of this in the forest while my body lay unconscious. But the smell of burnt ozone was real, the scorch marks on my jacket were real, and the being before me was undeniably impossibly real. His eyes opened suddenly, fully, fixing on me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously seen and transparent, as if he could read every thought, every doubt, every secret prayer I'd ever whispered into the darkness of sleepless nights. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask the thousand questions crowding my mind, but before I could form a single word, I heard a voice clear as crystal, warm as summer light, speaking directly into my thoughts. Peace, beloved child, I am Elhanan, and I have walked this earth since before your ancestors carved their first prayers into stone. What I am about to show you will test your faith, strengthen your soul, and burden you with a truth that humanity desperately needs, but may not be ready to receive. His physical lips hadn't moved, but I had heard him more clearly than any spoken word, and I knew with unshakable certainty that my life had just divided into two epochs. Everything before this moment, and everything that would come after. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of my basement, my back against the washing machine, watching Elhanan's chest rise and fall with that otherworldly rhythm, and I realized I was witnessing something that defied every scientific principle I'd ever been taught in school. The silver lines where his wounds had been were now glowing softly, pulsing with what looked like circuitry made of pure light, patterns that seemed to flow beneath his skin, like rivers of liquid starlight mapping their way through his body. I reached out hesitantly, my hand trembling, and touched one of these luminous pathways on his forearm, half expecting to be burned or shocked. Instead, I felt a warmth that went deeper than physical sensation, a comfort that reminded me of my grandmother's embrace when I was a child frightened by thunderstorms, that same assurance that everything would ultimately be all right. His eyes followed my hand with what I could only describe as gentleness, and in my mind I heard his voice again. What you see is not technology, as your scientists understand it, but the language of creation itself, the same divine code that knits together galaxies and sparks consciousness in the womb. We learned long ago to work with these frequencies rather than against them, to heal by aligning ourselves with the Creator's fundamental design. I pulled my hand back, overwhelmed, my mind racing to reconcile what my eyes were seeing with what my faith had taught me, wondering if this was blasphemy or revelation. Are you an angel? I whispered aloud, my voice cracking with emotion, and I saw something like sadness pass across his luminous features. Elhanan shifted on the couch, sitting up with a grace that seemed to require no effort despite his recent trauma, and gestured for me to come closer, which I did with a mixture of fear and irresistible curiosity pulling me forward. Your question deserves more than a simple answer. His telepathic voice resonated through my consciousness, carrying layers of meaning that words alone could never convey. In your ancient texts, my kind were indeed called angels by those who encountered us, but that word has been wrapped in so many layers of human interpretation, so many paintings and poems and doctrines, that its original meaning has been obscured like a mirror covered in dust. He reached out and placed his elongated fingers gently on my forehead, and suddenly I wasn't in my basement anymore, but standing on a hillside, under an impossibly clear night sky, watching figures that looked like Elhanan standing in formation around a rough stone stable where a light brighter than any star poured through the cracks in the walls. I could hear singing that made my soul ache with beauty, harmonies that seemed to be woven from the fabric of joy itself, and I knew without being told that I was witnessing the night of Christ's birth, from a perspective no human had ever been meant to see. We were there, Elhanan's voice continued, though I was still lost in the vision, not as the chubby, winged children your Renaissance painters imagined, but as guardians, as witnesses appointed by the one who spoke existence into being, watching as divinity clothed itself in human flesh, to walk among you. The vision faded and I was back in my basement, tears streaming down my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Why are you showing me this? I managed to ask, wiping my eyes with shaking hands, feeling simultaneously honored and terrified by what I'd just experienced. Elhanan stood slowly, and despite his slender frame, he seemed to fill the entire room with presence, with an authority that was somehow both commanding and infinitely gentle, because the time is approaching when humanity must understand that science and faith were never meant to be enemies, but two languages describing the same magnificent truth, he said, and I watched as he raised his hand and the air between us began to shimmer, revealing what looked like threads of light connecting everything in the room: the couch, the walls, my own body, his form, all woven together in an intricate pattern of breathtaking complexity. Your scientists speak of quantum entanglement, of fields and frequencies and the observer effect, slowly discovering what the prophets knew in their spirits, that all creation is one unified expression of the Creator's love, that separation is an illusion, and that consciousness itself is the bridge between the physical and the divine. I reached out to touch one of these visible threads and felt it vibrate under my fingertip, producing a note that I heard not with my ears but with something deeper, something that resonated in the core of who I was. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star, Elhanan continued, and the threads of light began to pulse in time with my heartbeat. And every thought you think ripples across dimensions you cannot see, affecting the whole in ways both subtle and profound. This is what Jesus came to show you, that you are not separate from God but expressions of God, that heaven is not a distant location but a frequency of consciousness, and that love is the fundamental force holding all existence together. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the floor, my mind struggling to contain the magnitude of what he was revealing, feeling like a cup too small for the ocean being poured into it. Then why do we suffer? I asked, the question bursting from somewhere deep and wounded inside me, all the pain and loss and confusion of my life suddenly demanding an answer. Why does God allow darkness, if we're all expressions of divine love? Elhanan knelt before me, his movements fluid and impossibly gentle, and placed both hands on my shoulders, his touch steady and grounding, because love without choice is not love but programming, and the Creator desired children, not robots, he said, and I could feel the weight of ancient sorrow in his words, the grief of watching humanity suffer through its learning across countless generations. Your world is a school, a sacred space where souls learn to choose light over darkness, forgiveness over revenge, unity over separation, and every choice ripples outward, shaping not just your world, but the entire cosmic tapestry in ways even my kind cannot fully comprehend. Jesus walked your earth not to condemn you for your struggles, but to show you what becomes possible when a human being fully embodies divine love. When someone chooses to see God in every face, especially the faces of the broken and the lost, the light patterns in the air around us began to swirl and coalesce into images. I saw wars and healings, hatred and forgiveness, destruction and creation, all woven together in a pattern that somehow, impossibly, revealed an underlying beauty and purpose. The healing you see in my body is the same healing available to your world, Elhanan whispered, and I felt those words settle into my chest like seeds being planted in fertile soil. But it requires humanity to remember what it has forgotten, that you are one family, one body, one expression of the infinite love that dreamed you into existence, and that the return of Christ you pray for is actually the awakening of Christ consciousness within the collective human heart. I found myself unable to look away from Elhanan's face as the implications of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket, both comforting and suffocating in their magnitude. His eyes, those impossible pools of swirling luminescence that seemed to contain entire galaxies within their depths, held mine with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in my entire life. Like every wall I'd ever built around my heart was transparent to him, the basement suddenly felt smaller and simultaneously infinite, as though the concrete walls had become permeable membranes barely separating us from vast cosmic realities, pressing in from all sides. You said you've been watching humanity for thousands of years, I whispered, my voice hoarse with emotion and barely controlled fear. Which means you witnessed everything, didn't you? You saw Jesus walk the earth, you saw the crucifixion, you saw what really happened. Elhanan's expression shifted into something that looked like reverence mixed with profound sorrow, and he nodded slowly, those elongated fingers of his moving to rest over the center of his chest where his heart would be. I was there, he said telepathically, and his voice in my mind carried harmonics of ancient grief and triumphant joy intertwined, along with others of my kind, standing invisible among the crowds who could not perceive us, witnessing the most significant moment in your planet's history unfold with terrible beauty. The air between us began to shimmer again, and I felt my consciousness being drawn forward into another vision. But this time I resisted, suddenly terrified of what I might see, of how seeing it might change me forever. But Elhanan's touch on my forehead was insistent and impossibly gentle, and I felt my resistance melting away like morning frost under sunlight as the basement dissolved around me, and I found myself standing on a dusty road under a merciless Middle Eastern sun. The heat was overwhelming, the kind that makes the air itself seem to waver and pulse, and I could smell the mix of human sweat, animal dung, and wild herbs that characterized the ancient world in ways no history book could ever capture. There were people all around me, pressed together in a crowd that surged and murmured with barely contained excitement, their robes and head coverings dusty and worn, their faces etched with the hard lines of lives lived under occupation and poverty. I turned slowly, disoriented and overwhelmed, and then I saw him walking through the center of the crowd, and my breath caught in my throat with such force that I actually gasped aloud. Jesus looked nothing like the sanitized paintings that had hung in my childhood Sunday school classroom, his skin darkened by sun and labor, his hands calloused and strong, his beard rough and his garments simple. But there was something in his eyes that made everything else fade to insignificance. Those eyes held a depth of compassion that seemed bottomless, a knowing that felt both intimate and cosmic. And when they passed over the crowd, I felt like he was seeing not just the surface of each person, but the entirety of their soul. Every wound and hope and secret fear laid bare before love that held no judgment. And there, standing at the edge of the crowd in forms that shimmered just slightly out of phase with normal reality, I saw them beings like Elhanan, tall and luminous and achingly beautiful, their presence unnoticed by the humans pressing past them, but their attention fixed completely on the carpenter from Nazareth who walked among his people with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. I watched as Jesus stopped to touch a leper that everyone else was avoiding, and I saw the celestial beings lean forward with what looked like breathless anticipation, as though even they who had existed for millennia were still capable of being moved by witnessing love in action. The man's skin healed instantly, under Jesus' touch, the corrupted flesh becoming whole and clean in a transformation that happened too quickly for the human eye to fully register. And I heard gasps and exclamations ripple through the crowd like wind through wheat. But what struck me most profoundly was not the miracle itself, but the expression on Jesus' face as he looked at the healed man, a look of such pure joy and connection that it was clear the healing had blessed him as much as the one who received it. Do you see? Elhanan's voice resonated through the vision, and I realized he was standing beside me now in this memory, his form more solid here than in my basement, as though this past moment somehow held more reality than the present. He did not heal from a place of superior power condescending to inferior beings, but from a recognition of unity, from knowing that what he did to the least of these he did to himself, to the Father, to all of creation. This is what your religious institutions have often failed to teach, that divinity is not about dominion but about radical, self-giving love that recognizes no separation between self and other. I felt tears streaming down my face as I watched Jesus move through the crowd, stopping to bless children, to speak words of encouragement to the brokenhearted, to laugh with genuine delight at something an old woman said to him, fully human and fully divine in ways that transcended the theological formulas I'd been taught. The celestial guardians watched it all with expressions of wonder that suggested they understood. They were witnessing something unprecedented in all the cosmos, something that was reshaping the very fabric of reality itself. The vision shifted, and suddenly we were standing on a dark hillside overlooking three crosses silhouetted against a sky that had turned the color of bruises, and I wanted to look away but found I could not. Compelled to witness what Elhanan was showing me, the air itself seemed to be screaming, reality groaning under the weight of what was happening, and I could see the celestial beings now arrayed in formations that stretched from earth to heaven, their faces stricken with grief so profound it seemed to shake the foundations of existence. We could have stopped it, Elhanan said beside me, and I heard agony in his telepathic voice. With a single thought we could have released power enough to vaporize every soldier, every official, everyone who contributed to this murder. But we were commanded to stand down, to let human free will play out to its most terrible conclusion, to let love be tested in the crucible of ultimate suffering. I watched as the man on the center cross raised his head, his face barely recognizable through the blood and swelling, and spoke words of forgiveness to those who were killing him, and I felt something break open in my chest, some long-sealed place of pain and cynicism cracking apart. The moment of his death registered across dimensions. I could see it. Waves of light and darkness colliding and then resolving into something new. Some fundamental shift in the spiritual architecture of reality that I lacked the vocabulary to describe. And then I was back in my basement, on my knees on the cold concrete floor, sobbing so hard my entire body shook, while Elhanan knelt beside me with his hand on my back, steady and present, letting me grieve and process and begin, just begin, to understand what I had been shown. I remained on my knees for what felt like hours but might have been only minutes, time having lost all meaning in the presence of this being who had witnessed the pivotal moment of human history with his own eyes. Elhanan's hand stayed on my back, warm despite his alien biology, and I could feel something flowing from him into me. Not another vision, but rather a steadying presence, like an anchor keeping me tethered to sanity while everything I thought I knew about reality reorganized itself into new configurations. When I finally lifted my head and wiped the tears from my face with trembling hands, I found him watching me with an expression that held no pity, only understanding and something that looked like respect, as though my emotional response had somehow validated something important to him. "There's more you need to see," he said into my mind, his telepathic voice gentle but insistent. "Moments that were never recorded in your scriptures, not because they were unimportant, but because those who witnessed them lacked the context to understand their significance." I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice, and watched as his eyes began to glow brighter, the swirling galaxies within them spinning faster until they filled my entire field of vision and pulled me forward into another time and place. The transition was smoother now, as though my consciousness was learning how to navigate these journeys through his memories, and I felt less disoriented as the basement faded and was replaced by a scene of such intimate beauty that my breath caught for the second time that night. I was standing in what appeared to be a simple home, the kind of modest dwelling that would have housed a working-class family in first-century Palestine, with rough-hewn wooden beams supporting the ceiling and the warm glow of oil lamps casting dancing shadows on whitewashed walls. Jesus sat at a low table with several people I recognized from biblical accounts as his disciples. But this was not the formal Last Supper I'd seen depicted in countless paintings and stained glass windows. This was something earlier, more casual, a simple meal, shared between friends who loved each other. What struck me immediately was the sound of his laughter, rich and unrestrained, as he responded to something Peter had said, his entire face transformed by genuine mirth in a way that made him seem simultaneously more human and more divine than any artistic representation I'd ever encountered. And there, standing in the corners of the room, invisible to everyone present except perhaps to Jesus himself, who occasionally glanced in their direction with a knowing smile, were three celestial beings whose forms pulsed with barely contained light, their attention fixed on the carpenter teacher with expressions of profound affection. I could see Elhanan among them, younger somehow, though I couldn't explain how I knew this, his features softer, and his stance less weary than the wounded being I'd pulled from the wreckage just hours ago. The ordinariness of the scene was what moved me most deeply, the way divinity had chosen to manifest not in overwhelming displays of power but in the simple breaking of bread with friends, in shared stories and gentle teasing and the comfortable silence of people who knew they were safe with each other. Jesus suddenly looked up and his eyes seemed to focus directly on where I stood as an invisible observer, and I felt my heart lurch in my chest as a smile played at the corners of his mouth, as though he could somehow perceive me across the gulf of 2,000 years, and found my presence there both expected and welcome. "Elhanan," he said aloud, and I watched the celestial being step forward slightly, his form shimmering into a state that was almost but not quite visible to the human occupants of the room who continued their conversation. "Unaware, my friend, you worry too much about what's coming. I can feel your concern from here even though you hide it well." The voice was extraordinary, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest and in the walls and in the very air itself, a voice that was fully human in its warmth and timbre, but somehow contained multitudes, layers of meaning packed into simple words. Elhanan bowed his head in a gesture of deep respect, and when he responded I heard his telepathic voice for the first time in this memory, younger and less burdened by sorrow than the voice I'd come to know. "Master, how can I not worry when I know what they will do to you? When I have seen the threads of possibility converging toward that terrible hill, you could prevent it all with a word, and yet you walk toward it with open eyes." Jesus stood and moved toward where Elhanan's shimmering form stood, and to my amazement he reached out and placed his hand directly on the celestial being's shoulder, a gesture of comfort from the divine to the angelic that inverted every hierarchy I'd been taught. "What you call terrible is necessary, my friend. It is the moment when infinite love will speak in a language that finite beings can finally understand, when the gap between creator and creation will be bridged not by power descending, but by divinity ascending through the full experience of human suffering and human triumph. You will understand when it's finished, I promise you." The scene shifted one final time, and now I stood on a hillside at dawn. The grass wet with dew, and the sky painted in shades of rose and gold that seemed too beautiful to be real. And there he was, Jesus in his resurrected form, his body somehow more substantial than before, yet also more luminous, as though the physical and spiritual dimensions of his being had achieved perfect integration. Dozens of celestial beings were arrayed before him, Elhanan among them, and they were all on their knees in postures of worship and wonder, while Jesus moved among them with a joy that was almost childlike in its exuberance, lifting them to their feet one by one and embracing them like beloved family members he'd been separated from for far too long. "Do you see now?" he asked them, his voice ringing with triumph that held no arrogance, only the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a bridge successfully built. "Do you see that love is stronger than death, that separation was always an illusion, that what I have done in this particular body at this particular moment in time has opened a doorway for every consciousness that will ever exist to remember its true nature as one with the Father?" Elhanan was weeping, luminous tears tracking down his alien features, and when Jesus reached him, the two embraced with such obvious affection that I felt tears spring to my own eyes again. "Now your watching can become guiding," Jesus said to all the assembled beings, his hand still on Elhanan's shoulder. "Now you can help them wake up to what has always been true, that they are not separate from me or from each other or from the source of all being. This is your commission, to be guardians not of information but of remembrance, to protect the truth of divine unity until the moment when they are collectively ready to fully embrace it." The vision released me then, and I was back in my basement, but I was not the same person who had entered it. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of what Jesus had actually accomplished, and what these celestial beings had been doing in the 2,000 years since that resurrection morning. And I looked at Elhanan with new eyes, seeing him now not as an alien intruder, but as an ancient guardian who had been faithfully serving a commission given by the Son of God himself. I stared at Elhanan with new comprehension dawning in my mind like sunrise breaking over a landscape. I thought I knew, but was only now truly seeing for the first time. The implications of what he'd shown me were staggering, restructuring not just my understanding of biblical history, but my entire conception of what angels actually were, what they had always been beneath the sanitized imagery of Renaissance paintings and children's Sunday school lessons. "You're kind," I whispered aloud, my voice hoarse from crying. "You're not separate from the physical universe at all, are you? You're part of creation just like us, beings with bodies and origins and histories, not abstract spirits hovering in some disconnected heaven." Elhanan's expression shifted into something that looked like relief, as though he'd been waiting for me to arrive at this conclusion on my own, rather than having it forced upon me. "We are what your ancestors called angels because they had no other frame of reference for consciousness that existed in forms different from their own," he responded, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of something almost like gratitude that I was understanding. "But we are indeed created beings, formed by the same source that formed you, inhabiting bodies that exist partially in dimensions your science is only beginning to theorize, serving purposes that were established before your species took its first breath on this planet." His hand moved to his chest where the wounds from the crash were still knitting themselves together with that impossible light, and I found myself leaning forward, desperate to understand every nuance of what he was revealing. The religious institutions built, structures of belief around, fragments of truth, Elhanan continued, and now I could detect a note of sorrow threading through his words. Not judgment, but genuine grief for how the message had been distorted over millennia of human interpretation and reinterpretation. "They taught you to expect Jesus to return as a conquering king descending from clouds to separate the worthy from the unworthy, to establish dominion through displays of overwhelming power that would force every knee to bend in fearful submission." He paused and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, those swirling galaxies in his irises spinning faster as though responding to the importance of what he was about to say. "But this understanding misses the entire point of what he accomplished on that resurrection morning. It reverts to old paradigms of power and hierarchy that his very existence was meant to transcend. It turns the greatest act of divine love into just another conquest narrative." I felt something tightening in my chest, a resistance born from years of traditional teaching warring with this new perspective that somehow felt more true than anything I'd been told in church. "Then what is the second coming?" I asked, hearing the tremor in my own voice. aware that I was standing at a threshold beyond which my old certainties could not follow. Elhanan's hand reached out and hovered near my heart, without quite touching, and I could feel warmth radiating from his palm like standing near a fire on a winter night. The return of Christ consciousness is not an external event, but an internal awakening, he said, and each word landed in my awareness with the weight of absolute truth, like puzzle pieces clicking into place to reveal a picture I'd been trying to see my entire life, without success until this moment. It is the moment when enough human beings simultaneously remember their true nature, as expressions of divine love, when the illusion of separation finally dissolves and you collectively recognize that you are all one body with Christ as the head, just as he tried to tell you, through parables and teachings that were too often interpreted literally, when they were meant to point toward mystical union. I watched as his hand began to glow brighter, that same otherworldly light that had first caught my attention at the crash site now pulsing with rhythms that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat, every act of selfless love, every moment of genuine compassion, every instance when a human being chooses unity over division. These are not preparations for his coming, but actual manifestations of his presence. The second coming is happening gradually through 10,000 small awakenings until critical mass is reached and the full revelation becomes possible. His words were rewiring something fundamental in my understanding, showing me that the apocalypse I'd been taught to fear was actually an unveiling I should anticipate with hope rather than dread, a graduation rather than a judgment, a remembering rather than a reckoning. And your role, the role of all your kind, I said slowly, pieces assembling themselves in my mind even as I spoke them aloud. You've been here all along as guardians of this truth, protecting humanity not from external threats, but from forgetting to completely who we really are, keeping the flame of divine remembrance. Elhanan's hand finally made contact with my chest, and the moment his palm pressed against my heart, I ceased to exist as a separate individual and became something infinitely larger, my consciousness exploding outward, like a supernova expanding into every corner of creation simultaneously. I was no longer in my basement, but everywhere at once, experiencing what could only be described as the collective heartbeat of humanity, billions of souls, breathing and loving and struggling and hoping, all of us connected by threads of light so brilliant and obvious that I couldn't understand how I'd spent my entire life blind to them. The sensation wasn't frightening despite its overwhelming intensity. Instead, it felt like coming home after an exile so long I'd forgotten I was even lost, like remembering a language I'd spoken fluently before birth, but had been forced to forget in the trauma of entering physical form. Elhanan's voice surrounded me not from outside but from within, emanating from the same source as my own thoughts. And I understood with sudden clarity that this was what prayer had always been meant to feel like. Not words thrown hopefully toward a distant deity, but communion with a presence that had never been separate from me for even a single instant. This is what Jesus tried to show them, Elhanan whispered through our shared awareness, and I could feel his ancient grief at how the message had been obscured, that the kingdom of God is not a location you travel to after death, but a state of consciousness available in every moment, a recognition that you are already and always have been living and moving within the very body of the divine. I watched through his eyes as memories that weren't mine flooded through my awareness, scenes of Jesus touching lepers and feeling not just their skin healing, but their souls remembering they had never been separate from God's love, moments of him looking into the eyes of prostitutes and tax collectors, and seeing not sinners requiring redemption, but fragments of divinity who had temporarily forgotten their true identity. The visions shifted, and I saw what Elhanan meant about the second coming, understanding it now not as a singular dramatic event, but as a gradual awakening, rippling across the collective consciousness of humanity, like dawn spreading across a planet's surface. I witnessed countless moments throughout history when individuals had experienced this same revelation I was having now, mystics and saints and ordinary people who had suddenly seen through the illusion of separation and glimpsed the underlying unity of all existence, each awakening adding momentum to a wave that was building toward an inevitable breakthrough. I saw that every act of authentic love was Jesus returning. Every moment of true forgiveness was his presence manifesting. Every instance of someone choosing compassion over judgment was the second coming happening in miniature. Rehearsals for the grand remembering when enough humans would awaken simultaneously, that the entire species would shift into a new mode of consciousness. Elhanan showed me how this aligned perfectly with the scientific understanding of emergence, how complex systems reach tipping points where quantitative changes suddenly produce qualitative transformations. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly, water becoming steam, humanity becoming something new while remaining essentially itself. The crucifixion and resurrection were a pattern, his voice explained as I watched light spreading through neural networks of human connection across the globe, a demonstration that death and transformation are not opposites, but partners in the dance of evolution, that what looks like ending is actually the precondition for unprecedented beginning, and this pattern is now playing out on a species-wide scale as you approach the cosmic moment that will catalyze your collective chrysalis. I felt tears streaming down my physical face back in the basement even as my expanded awareness soared through this vision of humanity's potential, seeing how every struggle and suffering had been labor pains preparing for a birth that was now imminent. The experience deepened and I found myself standing in what felt like the throne room of creation itself, though there was no throne and no room, just infinite presence that was somehow more personal and intimate than any human relationship I'd ever known. I understood that this was what Christians called the Father, what Muslims called Allah, what Hindus called Brahman, what scientists called the unified field, all names pointing toward a reality so fundamental that it preceded and transcended every attempt to capture it in language or doctrine. This presence didn't speak in words but in direct knowing, and I understood that it loved humanity with an intensity that would incinerate any separation between lover and beloved, that every religion had been an attempt to preserve some fragment of this truth in forms that developing human consciousness could tolerate without being overwhelmed. I saw that Jesus had been God's way of translating infinite divine love into a human-sized demonstration that we could witness and relate to, the ultimate act of divine communication where the message and the messenger became one, and that his promise to return was really a promise that this translation would eventually complete itself in all of us. You are all meant to become what he was. Elhanan's voice resonated through the infinite presence surrounding me, not to worship him from a distance but to embody the same consciousness he embodied, to recognize that Christ is not a last name but a state of being, the awakened awareness that you and the Father are one just as he proclaimed in words that scandalized the religious authorities of his time. The presence pulsed with what felt like divine laughter, not mocking but delighted, the joy of a parent watching children finally understand a lesson that had been taught in countless ways until comprehension finally dawned. When Elhanan's hand lifted from my chest, I gasped and collapsed forward, my individual consciousness slamming back into the confines of my singular body with a shock that felt almost violent after the expansiveness I'd just experienced. My basement materialized around me again with its concrete walls and exposed pipes, everything exactly as it had been, yet completely transformed, because I was no longer the same person looking at it. I had been fundamentally rewired at a level deeper than thought or belief. That's what's coming for all of you, Elhanan said gently as I struggled to regulate my breathing and process what had just happened, his physical voice sounding strange and limited after the telepathic communion we just shared. I looked up at him with tears still streaming down my face, aware that I'd just been given a preview of humanity's destiny, a glimpse of what we were all evolving toward whether we consciously knew it or not, and the beauty of it was almost unbearable in its perfection. How soon? I managed to whisper, my voice breaking with the weight of what I now carried, the knowledge that would make it impossible to ever return to my previous limited understanding of what Jesus had taught and what his return truly meant. Elhanan's eyes held infinite compassion as he responded, sooner than the skeptics believe, later than the impatient hope, but inevitable as sunrise, because it's not something that might happen, but something that's already happening, has been happening since the moment he said it is finished and sealed the pattern into the fabric of creation itself, and now the cosmic conditions are aligning to accelerate what has always been unfolding. I was still trembling from the vision when Elhanan moved to the small basement window, his luminous form casting shadows that seemed to bend in ways that defied the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. He gestured for me to join him, and when I stood beside him looking out at the ordinary suburban night, he placed 2 fingers against my temple, and suddenly the darkness outside began to shimmer and ripple like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The stars I'd known my entire life started to pulse with rhythms I could now perceive, and I realized with mounting awe that they weren't just burning balls of gas but living nodes in a cosmic network that had been transmitting information since before Earth's oceans formed. Your scientists call it the cosmic web, Elhanan whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that made my bones resonate, but they see only the physical structure, the gravity and dark matter holding galaxies in relationship to one another. They cannot yet measure what flows through these connections, the consciousness that uses matter as its canvas. The air itself seemed to thicken with presence as he spoke, and I watched in amazement as layers of reality I'd never suspected began revealing themselves. Like a photograph developing in chemical solution, what had appeared to be empty space between stars now glowed with intricate geometries of light, vast patterns that reminded me simultaneously of neural networks and of the sacred geometry I'd seen in ancient cathedrals, and I understood these weren't separate things but reflections of the same divine mathematics that structured everything from atoms to galaxies to the firing of thoughts in my overwhelmed brain. The alignment coming is not merely astronomical, but ontological, Elhanan continued. And though I didn't fully understand the terminology, I felt the meaning downloading directly into my comprehension. Your solar system is moving into a region of space where the membrane between what you call physical and spiritual becomes naturally permeable, where the veil that has allowed you to experience separation as if it were real will thin to the point of transparency. Through the window I began to see them now, beings of light moving through my neighbors' yards like graceful currents in an invisible ocean, some humanoid in form and others so geometrically abstract that my mind struggled to process their shapes, all of them going about purposes I couldn't fathom, but that felt somehow coordinated and intentional. I gripped the windowsill to steady myself as the full implication crashed over me, that these beings had always been here, that the spiritual realm wasn't somewhere else, but right here interpenetrating physical reality, separated only by a difference in frequency or dimension that human senses had been unable to perceive. When the alignment completes, when Earth passes fully into this new cosmic environment, the gift of sight will return to your species, Elhanan said with something like reverence in his tone, and you will see what the prophets and mystics have always seen, what children sometimes glimpse before they're taught it's imaginary, what Jesus saw constantly and tried to help others perceive. When he spoke of having eyes to see and ears to hear, I thought of all the biblical accounts of angels appearing to terrified humans, how the first words were always fear not, and I understood now that the terror came not from the angels themselves, but from the sudden ripping away of the veil, the overwhelming shock of perceiving dimensions of reality that consciousness hadn't been prepared to process. This is what Revelation was trying to describe, I heard myself say, the words emerging from some deeper knowing that the vision had awakened in me, not the end of the world, but the end of the world as we've perceived it, the apocalypse that means unveiling. Elhanan turned to me with such profound approval in his ancient eyes that I felt simultaneously like a student who'd finally grasped a difficult lesson and like a child being celebrated by a proud parent. Yes, he said simply, and that single word carried the weight of millennia of waiting for humanity to reach this understanding. He showed me then how the increase in spiritual experiences across the planet in recent decades wasn't coincidence but symptom, how near-death experiences and mystical awakenings and even the rising interest in meditation and consciousness exploration were all evidence that the veil was already beginning to thin, that sensitive individuals were picking up the first whispers of what would soon become undeniable to everyone. I saw graphs and charts appearing in my mind's eye showing exponential curves of awakening experiences, how the pattern matched exactly what you'd expect in a system approaching a phase transition, and I marveled at how science and spirituality were revealing themselves as to languages, describing the same underlying transformation. Your religious texts called it the day when every I shall see him, Elhanan continued, his hand sweeping to encompass the beings of light, still visible through the window. And this is literally true, but not in the way your churches have taught, because Christ consciousness is not confined to a single body descending from clouds, but as the fundamental nature of reality itself. And when the veil lifts, you will see that everything, absolutely everything, is the body of God and always has been. The beings outside seemed to grow brighter as if responding to his words, and I felt rather than heard their songs, vast harmonies that had apparently been singing through creation since the beginning, the music that ancient Pythagoras had called the harmony of the spheres and that modern physicists were rediscovering in string theories. Vibrations. Elhanan let his hand drop from my temple, but my perception remained altered, as if something had been permanently switched on in my awareness that could never be fully turned off again. This is why I came, he said softly, his wounds from the crash now almost completely healed. glowing with that same gentle light I could see in the beings outside, to prepare messengers who could help your species understand that what's approaching is not to be feared but celebrated, not Judgment Day but Graduation Day, not the angry return of a disappointed deity, but the joyful reunion of children with a Father who has never stopped loving them even when they forgot how to perceive His presence. I looked at him with tears flowing freely again, understanding now why he'd risked everything to reach Earth, why his kind had been watching and waiting, and occasionally intervening throughout human history. Guardian angels in the most literal sense, working to midwife humanity through the dangerous adolescence of separation, consciousness toward the mature awakening that was now nearly upon us. The date he would soon download into my heart suddenly felt less like a burden, and more like a privilege, the coordinates of humanity's rebirth written in the language of cosmic timing. And I knew with absolute certainty that whether people believed my testimony or dismissed me as delusional, I would spend whatever time remained helping prepare the way for the most important sunrise in human history, the dawn when we would finally see clearly what Jesus had been showing us all along, that we are and always have been living and moving and having our being within the infinite love of God. I was still absorbing the magnitude of what Elhanan had revealed when the first sound reached us, a low mechanical hum that felt wrong in the intimate space of my basement, like a discordant note invading a sacred symphony. His head snapped toward the small window with an alertness that reminded me he was still a being, designed for survival across hostile cosmic distances, and I watched his luminous eyes narrow as he perceived something my still adjusting senses couldn't yet detect. "They've found me," he said with a resignation that carried centuries of experience with human institutions that feared what they couldn't control. And before I could ask who he meant, I saw them through the window, dark figures in tactical gear spreading across my lawn with weapons drawn, and movements coordinated with military precision. My heart lurched into my throat as spotlights suddenly blazed to life, turning my modest backyard into a harsh stage where shadows fled and every detail stood exposed, under interrogation of artificial brightness. "How did they know?" I whispered, instinctively stepping back from the window, though I knew it was already too late for hiding. And Elhanan touched my shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the danger now surrounding us. "Your governments have been monitoring for dimensional incursions since they first split the atom and accidentally glimpsed the larger reality," he explained, his voice calm despite the shouting I could now hear from outside, commands being barked through megaphones demanding that I come out with my hands visible. When my ship crossed the barrier between realms, it left a signature in their detection equipment, a disturbance in fields they've learned to measure but don't fully understand, and they've been triangulating my location since the moment I crashed. The basement door at the top of the stairs suddenly shuddered under impact, the sound of a battering ram, applied with methodical force that told me we had perhaps seconds before trained agents would flood down to find us. I looked at Elhanan with panic rising in my chest, all my protective instincts screaming that I couldn't let them take him, that somehow this being who had shown me the architecture of divine love couldn't be allowed to end up on a dissection table in some classified facility buried under miles of desert. "They will not harm me," he said, reading my terror with that unsettling accuracy, "but they will contain me and silence you, and the message you carry cannot be locked away in darkness. When humanity stands so close to the light." His hand moved from my shoulder to hover over his chest where his wounds had healed, and I watched in amazement as his skin began to glow more intensely, patterns of light emerging that looked like circuit boards designed by angels, technology and biology and pure consciousness woven into something my vocabulary had no words to describe. The door upstairs exploded inward with a crack of splintering wood, and immediately boots thundered on the floor above us, voices shouting clear and secure as they swept through my modest home. And I knew the basement door would be breached within heartbeats. "What you're about to witness will frighten you," Elhanan said, his voice taking on harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "But remember that all power comes from the Creator, and those who serve Him need never fear those who serve only earthly authorities." I wanted to ask what he meant, but there was no time, as the basement door burst open and the stairwell filled with red laser sights painting dots across our chests. Commands to get down on the ground shouted with aggressive authority that expected instant obedience. Elhanan raised his arms not in surrender, but in a gesture I recognized from religious art, the same posture Christ held in paintings of the Transfiguration. And what happened next would replay in my mind for the rest of my life. with perfect clarity despite its impossibility. Light erupted from his body with an intensity that should have blinded me, but instead seemed to illuminate rather than overwhelm, and I watched as the agents on the stairs simply stopped, mid-motion, as if someone had pressed pause on reality itself, their faces locked in expressions of aggression that now looked absurdly frozen. "He grants his angels charge over those who dwell in his secret place," Elhanan said, and I heard in his words an echo of Psalm 91, that ancient promise of protection now manifesting in my basement. Through technology that looked like magic and faith that functioned like physics, the air between us and the frozen agents shimmered with the same geometric patterns I'd seen in the cosmic web, and I understood he'd created some kind of temporal field or dimensional barrier, buying us precious moments by stepping slightly outside the flow of time that held the intruders locked. "This requires energy I cannot sustain in this damaged form," he continued, and I noticed for the first time that despite his healed wounds he looked diminished somehow, as if the crash and now this protection was draining reserves that even his advanced biology couldn't indefinitely replenish. I grabbed his arm. Without thinking, the same instinct that had driven me to pull him from the burning wreckage now demanding I help him reach safety, and together we moved past the frozen agents up the stairs, their weapons tracking targets they could no longer perceive in whatever slice of altered time we now occupied. The night air hit my face as we emerged from my house into a scene of controlled chaos. Dozens of vehicles surrounding the property with lights strobing red and blue, helicopters hovering overhead with searchlights sweeping, the full apparatus of government power deployed against one wounded traveler who carried only truth. Elhanan led me with surprising speed across my yard toward the woods, where his ship had crashed, and I could feel the temporal field beginning to collapse behind us as agents started to move, again in slow motion, their shouts distorting like audio played at wrong speeds. "Your ship can still fly," I gasped as we ran, branches whipping at my face while he seemed to glide through obstacles with impossible grace. And he nodded, though I could see the effort this was costing him, his light flickering like a candle struggling against wind. "Enough to return home," he said, and the word carried such longing that I realized how far from his own kind he'd been, how isolated his vigil-watching humanity must have felt across the long centuries. We burst into the clearing where twisted metal still smoked from the crash, but as Elhanan approached the wreckage it began to respond to his presence, pieces lifting and rotating, and reassembling with liquid fluidity that proved the craft was as alive as its pilot. Consciousness and vehicle merged in partnership my culture had never imagined. "I have only moments before they overcome the field," he said, turning to face me with urgency burning in his ancient eyes, and I knew we'd reached the culmination of everything, the moment when he would entrust me with the burden and blessing that would define the rest of my days. He reached for me then with both hands, and I didn't hesitate or pull away even though his luminous fingers trembled with the effort of maintaining the protective field that kept dozens of armed agents moving through time like insects trapped in amber. His palms pressed against my chest directly over my heart, and the warmth that flooded through me was nothing like the heat of fire or fever, but instead felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Like every cell in my body suddenly remembered a song it had been singing before I was born. "What you are about to receive has been entrusted to only a handful of souls across human history," Elhanan said, his voice resonating not just in my ears but somehow in my bones, in the spaces between my thoughts where consciousness meets something larger than individual awareness. Behind us I could hear the temporal field beginning to fracture, agents' voices rising from distorted slow motion back toward normal speed, shouts of confusion mixing with barked orders to secure the perimeter, and I knew we were living in borrowed seconds stolen from the inevitable. "I am placing within you the knowledge of signs and seasons, the specific alignment of cosmic and human consciousness that will mark the return of the one you call Christ," he continued, and his eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that I couldn't have looked away if the earth itself had opened beneath us. The touch of his hands against my heart became pressure, then heat, then something beyond physical sensation entirely, as if he'd opened a door in my chest and was pouring starlight directly into the cavity where my soul resided, and I gasped as information began flooding into me in ways that bypassed language and logic to write themselves directly onto the fabric of my being. I saw dates not as numbers on calendars, but as positions in a vast celestial dance, planetary alignments and solar cycles woven together with human events and patterns that revealed the Creator's fingerprints across both cosmic and earthly scales. The vision showed me a specific configuration when Jupiter and Saturn would align in ways they hadn't since the Star of Bethlehem guided wise men to a manger, when solar activity would reach peaks that scientists would measure, but not understand were attunement frequencies preparing human consciousness for expansion. I witnessed the signs that would precede the Great Awakening, not cataclysms of judgment as fire and brimstone preachers had threatened, but instead, synchronicities multiplying across the globe, millions of individuals simultaneously experiencing dreams of unity and love, children speaking of memories that couldn't be their own, the veil between spiritual and material reality growing so thin that even skeptics would begin perceiving the light that had always surrounded them. He will not return in clouds with armies, Elhanan's voice echoed through the visions, but in a moment of collective human consciousness reaching the frequency of unconditional love, when enough souls remember, they are all expressions of the one divine source. I saw humanity as a single organism finally, awakening to its true nature, 7 billion cells, suddenly recognizing they were part of one body, and in that recognition the Christ consciousness would bloom not in a single person, but in all people simultaneously. The second coming not as an external event, but as an internal revolution of awareness. The beauty of it overwhelmed me, and I felt tears streaming down my face as I understood that every major religion had glimpsed pieces of this truth, but human institutions had fragmented the vision into competing doctrines, missing the central message that we are all one in God's infinite love. The download of information continued in waves that crashed over my ordinary human awareness, each surge bringing new understanding that rearranged everything I thought I knew about existence into configurations both simpler and more profound. I learned that the date was not fixed but probability-based, dependent on humanity reaching critical mass of consciousness evolution, though the cosmic window would align optimally within a specific period that I now carried in my heart like a secret. Burning with urgency, Elhanan showed me the signs I should watch for and share, the markers that would indicate humanity's readiness, telling me that my role was not to convince or convert, but simply to plant seeds of awareness in those whose souls were prepared to receive them. You will be doubted and dismissed, called delusional and dangerous, he said with compassion for the burden he was placing on my two human shoulders, but you will also recognize others who carry pieces of this truth, messengers scattered across your world, being awakened by my kind and by direct divine inspiration, and together you will form a network of light that will help guide humanity through the transition. I felt the weight of responsibility settling into me alongside the revelations, understanding that my comfortable anonymous life had ended the moment I chose to pull him from that burning wreckage, and there was no returning to the illusion of normalcy when you'd been entrusted with knowledge that could help shepherd your entire species toward its greatest evolutionary leap. The information kept coming in streams of pure knowing, showing me how to recognize genuine spiritual awakening versus false prophets who would multiply as the time approached, how to remain grounded in love when fearmongers would try to twist the message into apocalyptic terror, how to trust the inner guidance that would become stronger now that he'd activated dormant capacities in my consciousness. Finally, the torrent of revelation began to slow, and I became aware again of my physical body standing in the clearing with Elhanan's hand still pressed against my chest, though now his light had dimmed considerably, and I could see the effort it cost him to remain manifested in this dimension. It is done, he whispered, and his hands fell away, leaving me feeling simultaneously emptied and more full than I'd ever been, as if he'd removed everything false and replaced it with concentrated truth. The temporal field collapsed completely in that moment, and I heard shouts very close now, beams of flashlights cutting through the trees as agents crashed through the undergrowth toward us, with weapons ready and orders to secure the target. Elhanan turned toward his ship, which had completed its impossible reassembly, and now waited with an opening dilating in its side like a living thing preparing to receive its wounded pilot. And he looked back at me one final time with eyes that held such love and faith that I felt strengthened despite my terror of what came next. Tell them what you have seen, he said simply, and trust that the same power that raised Christ from death and sustained my kind across millennia of service will protect you as you fulfill this calling. His form began to fade even before he reached the ship, becoming translucent as he shifted back toward whatever dimensional frequency his species naturally occupied, and I understood he'd been sustaining physical manifestation only through tremendous will and was finally releasing that burden. I wanted to thank him, to tell him that pulling him from the wreckage had become the most important choice of my existence. But words seemed inadequate for the gratitude overwhelming my heart. So instead I simply placed my hand over the spot where his palms had rested, and nodded, a gesture of acceptance that I would carry this message forward no matter the cost. His ship lifted silently into the night sky, its surface rippling with colors that had no names in human language, and I stood alone in the clearing watching it accelerate upward, until it became just another star among thousands, before vanishing completely beyond the veil of atmosphere and into the infinite dark where his kind-traveled paths we were only beginning to remember existed. My legs gave out and I dropped to my knees in the cold earth, hands pressed against my chest where warmth still radiated from the place he'd touched, and the tears came not from sadness but from a joy so overwhelming that my human heart could barely contain it without breaking open like a seed that must split before new life can emerge. Behind me I heard the agents finally reaching the clearing, their tactical boots pounding the ground and their voices shouting commands that seemed to come from a different world entirely, a reality still trapped in fear and separation while I knelt in the aftermath of revelation that had shattered every limitation I'd ever accepted about existence. The knowledge Elhanan had placed within me pulsed like a second heartbeat, not as words or images anymore, but as a living presence woven into my very consciousness, and I understood that I could never unknow what I now carried, that I had been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed from the ordinary man who'd heard a crash just hours ago into something new, a messenger bearing truth that could help reshape human understanding of our place in God's infinite creation. They surrounded me with weapons raised and harsh lights blinding my tear-filled eyes, demanding I identify myself and explain what had happened here. But their aggression couldn't touch the peace that had settled into my bones like warm honey filling every hollow place where doubt and fear had once nested. I raised my hand slowly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of openness, wanting them to see I was no threat. And when I spoke, my voice came steady and clear despite everything that had just occurred, carrying a certainty I'd never possessed before tonight. I've been given a message, I said simply, and even though they barked more questions and threats, I saw something flicker in the eyes of the youngest agent, a recognition or hunger that told me his soul was listening even if his training demanded he treat me as a security threat. They detained me, of course, took me to facilities with windowless rooms and interrogators who tried every technique to extract information about what I'd seen and what the being had told me. But I found that Elhanan's final gift included a clarity about what to share and what to protect, a wisdom that let me speak truth without casting pearls before those whose consciousness wasn't ready to receive them. For 3 days, they held me, and during those 72 hours I witnessed small miracles. Hardened military personnel who found themselves crying without understanding why when I spoke about divine love, scientists whose rational worldviews cracked open just enough to let light through, even my interrogators gradually softening as if proximity to what I carried was contagious, awakening something dormant in their own souls. On the morning of the 4th day they released me without explanation, and I understood that orders had come from high enough in the chain of command that someone had decided I was either harmless or that containing me would create more problems than letting me go, and perhaps that too was part of the divine orchestration Elhanan had promised would protect me. I returned to a home that looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. Every ordinary object now transparent with the sacred, the morning light through my kitchen window revealing itself as the same divine radiance that filled distant galaxies and the space between atoms, all of it one continuous expression of the Creator's love made manifest in infinite forms, the knowledge of what was coming, the specific convergence of cosmic timing and human consciousness evolution that would mark Christ's return as awakening rather than judgment, burned in my heart with an urgency that made my former life's concerns seem like games children play while unaware their parents are preparing a feast. I began to write, words pouring through me faster than my hands could capture them. Testimonies and teachings that came not from my limited understanding, but from the download of divine truth that Elhanan had placed within me. And I shared them however I could, through writings and conversations, in chance meetings that I'd learned were never truly chance, but always divine appointments orchestrated by the same intelligence that positioned stars and guided angels across millennia of service. I discovered others as he'd promised I would, fellow messengers who'd received their own revelations, through different means, but carrying pieces of the same essential truth, that we are all one in God's love and that humanity was approaching its greatest transformation. the collective awakening that would allow us to finally perceive the spiritual reality that had always surrounded us, like water surrounds fish who've never known they were. Swimming together, we formed networks of light, not organizations with hierarchies and doctrines, but organic connections between souls who recognized each other by frequency, by the way our hearts resonated at the same pitch of love and hope and absolute faith in the divine plan unfolding exactly as it should. The years since that night have brought challenges I couldn't have imagined in my old life. Moments of doubt when the world's darkness seemed overwhelming, and my message felt like whispers against hurricanes of fear and hatred. But in those moments I would place my hand over my heart and feel the warmth that never completely faded. Elhanan's final gift reminding me that I was never alone, and that the same power that sustained his kind across ages and raised Jesus from death was carrying me through every difficulty. I've watched the signs he showed me begin manifesting one by one, the planetary alignments moving into position, and the synchronicities multiplying across the globe. Millions reporting dreams of unity and children speaking wisdom beyond their years. The veil growing thinner as more hearts open to the truth that had always been waiting for us to remember. I understand now that pulling him from that burning wreckage wasn't really my choice, but rather a yes I gave to a question the divine had been asking my soul since before I was born, and that everything in my life had been preparation for becoming a vessel through which this message could flow into a world desperate for hope. When Christ returns in that moment of collective awakening, when humanity finally reaches the frequency of unconditional love and recognizes we are all expressions of the one divine source, I will remember the dying alien who was really an ancient angel, who loved us enough to risk everything to prepare even one more human heart for the glory that approaches. And I will fall to my knees again in gratitude for the blessed burden of carrying truth that could help shepherd my species home to God. What truth has been placed in your heart that you've been afraid to share with the world? Subscribe to hear more revelations that could change everything you thought you knew about divine purpose and the magnificent destiny awaiting humanity.